When a woman stops sacrificing herself, not for approval, not for the sake of being right, not because of the familiar "that's how it should be," something extraordinary begins to happen. The world starts to change. But not because the world has changed, because she has. One morning she wakes up and, for the first time, doesn't ask herself, "What do I need to do today for everyone else?" She doesn't think about how to be convenient, how to save face, how to remain the image of a good wife, daughter, friend, or colleague. She just breathes, lives, listens to herself. That is the moment of choice. Choosing herself is not a rejection of love. It is not selfishness. It is not coldness. It is the deepest act of respect for her own soul. As Alfred Adler, the Austrian psychotherapist and one of the founding fathers of depth psychology, once said, "The true task of a woman is to become herself, even if it means being misunderstood." And he also loved to say, "All human problems are relationship problems," which is why, when a woman doesn't live from her own truth, when her life is only sacrifice, only an attempt to please, only suffering, she loses contact with herself. And when she loses contact with herself, she loses connection with others too. Sacrifice destroys relationships. It turns love into a transaction, into expectations, into resentment. But when a woman takes a step toward herself, gently, quietly, without guilt, everything begins to heal. Not instantly, not loudly, but in the most real way. In that moment, a woman can finally ask herself a simple, yet long-forgotten question. What do I want? When a woman stops sacrificing, she stops saving others at the cost of her own life. She begins to live, and that is the most powerful thing she can do, for herself and for the ones she loves. Alfred Adler said, "Every person must come to understand that the responsibility for their life lies with them alone." It's frightening, and at the same time, liberating. As long as a woman lives as a victim, she waits for someone to come and change her reality, to understand her, to appreciate her, to save her. But no one can come and live through her pain for her, her fears, her choices. Choosing herself is an act of adulthood. It means, I no longer hand others the keys to my life. She no longer says, "I would leave if it weren't for the kids," or "I'd start my own business if my husband allowed it," or "I'd choose myself if I were younger, freer, braver." She simply takes a step. Sometimes it's a step into the unknown, sometimes a step inward, but always a step toward herself. And the moment she takes it, the most important thing begins. Healing. Wounds begin to heal. Old pain starts to dissolve. Even relationships begin to mend, not because she's waiting for someone to change her world, but because she's changing it herself. This is what mature love looks like. This is what inner freedom feels like. A woman who has chosen herself can stay, not because she must, but because she wants to, because she has something to give, because she is full. Until that moment, she was only half alive, a shadow, smiling but tired, loving but without joy, living but not as herself. The awakening begins with one simple, honest word: enough. There is a silence in which loneliness is born, and there is a silence in which strength is born. When a woman chooses herself, the first silence that arrives is the silence of solitude. But if she can stay with it, the second one comes. The pain of losing illusions, the grief of letting go of false hopes, the farewell to the life she was supposed to live. It's not easy. Alfred Adler once wrote, "Life demands courage, the courage to be imperfect, the courage to be yourself." And it is precisely that courage that becomes the first gift a woman receives when she chooses herself. Suddenly, she begins to hear her own voice, truly hear it. It had always been there, but before she drowned it out, with busyness, with obligations, with the opinions and expectations of others. Now everything is different. Sometimes in that silence, she cries. Sometimes she laughs. Sometimes she has no idea what to do next. And that's okay, because for the first time, it's her path, not imposed, not earned through pain, not forced, chosen. And from that moment on, she becomes whole. She gains the right not to explain, the right not to prove, the right to be, boldly, simply, with dignity. A woman who stops sacrificing herself does not become hard. She becomes deep. She gains something that cannot be bought or faked, inner stillness. And from that stillness, strength is born, unseen yet unshakable, quiet yet undeniable, the kind of strength that leads her forward to real life. When a woman chooses herself, the world doesn't change overnight. People around her stay the same. The phone still rings, someone is still unhappy, someone still expects something, someone still criticizes, but something subtle shifts. She no longer responds the way she used to. Before, every word could wound her. Now, not everything gets under her skin. Before, her yes often meant a no to herself. Now she's learning to say no, not with bitterness, but with respect for her own boundaries. She stops being a prisoner of expectations. Alfred Adler wrote, "The primary task of a human being is not to meet the expectations of others, but to live in accordance with their own purpose." A woman who no longer sacrifices herself does not become indifferent. She becomes precise. She knows exactly what she needs. She can feel precisely where she begins to lose herself. She understands with clarity which relationships are no longer alive and which ones still give her life. This clarity frightens those who were used to her obedience, but it inspires those who are ready to see her as real. When a woman chooses herself, she loses some people, and it hurts, but she finds others. And that is healing. A woman walking her own path may walk it alone at times, but she is never lonely again, because beside her is herself, whole, ripening, at peace, and the world begins to respond to her differently, not instantly, but inevitably, because the world always reflects who you've become. Choosing yourself is not a one-time act. It's a process, a journey. A woman who stops sacrificing herself often doesn't know who she is at first, because she's played too many roles for too long, said yes too often when everything inside her was screaming no, feared being not enough too many times. But now, she's coming home, not to a house, to herself. And on this path, she discovers something remarkable. She doesn't have to be strong all the time, doesn't have to be right all the time, doesn't have to always be in control or fully resourced. She gives herself permission to be alive. Alfred Adler once said, "A woman can only become strong when she accepts herself as she is, imperfect, feeling flawed, but real." And that acceptance, that is love, not the kind you have to earn, but the kind you give to yourself. She no longer saves everyone around her because she understands everyone has the right to their own path, their own mistakes, their own lessons. She no longer explains herself where she isn't being heard because she knows value lies not in words, but in presence. She simply is, not to please, not to meet expectations, but to breathe, to feel, to live. And this life, it's not loud, but it radiates so much light that being near her feels like coming home. Alfred Adler once said, "A woman does not bloom through struggle, but through understanding her own strength. Strength is when you remain yourself, even when the world demands you be someone else." When a woman chooses herself, she begins to set boundaries, not walls, not traps, but quiet, clear lines. Here is where I exist, and beyond this is no longer me. She didn't know how to do this before, because she confused love with self-sacrifice, because she was afraid that if she said no, she wouldn't be loved, because she believed that being good meant being convenient. But now she knows being true to yourself is more important than being accepted by everyone. Alfred Adler wrote, "Maturity is when you stop expecting someone to save you, and you simply step up and become an adult." And so the woman becomes just that, grown, not hardened, but grounded. She creates boundaries, not because she has become cold, but because she no longer wants to lose herself. Now she no longer goes where she's not heard. She no longer explains herself to those who don't try to understand. She no longer burns herself out trying to be needed. She chooses and respects her choice, and the world responds in kind, with respect, with calm, with new people who expect nothing from her except one thing, that she be herself. Boundaries are not about distance, they are about dignity. Alfred Adler said, "True respect is born where a person knows their worth and lives according to that knowledge." That knowledge isn't loud. It doesn't shout. It lives in posture, in silence, in a steady gaze. A woman who has chosen herself no longer proves anything. She simply lives the way she wants, and that is true freedom. When a woman stops sacrificing herself, inspiration begins to return, not right away. First comes exhaustion, because her soul is no longer holding the weight of everyone else, because her body, for the first time, allows itself to exhale. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the taste for life returns, small, quiet. At first, like a shadow. She catches herself smiling for no reason, singing when she's alone, wanting to do something just for herself, not out of duty, not for benefit, but simply because she feels like it. This is inspiration, the quiet touch of life that arrives when a woman is finally at peace with herself. Alfred Adler wrote, "Creativity awakens in a person when they stop suppressing their true self and begin to honor their own desires." A woman who chooses herself begins to create again, not necessarily paintings, sometimes the silence in her home, sometimes a cozy morning, sometimes her new destiny. She creates not from tension but from fullness, because now she gives from wholeness, not from depletion. She no longer gives herself away piece by piece, she shares her light. Inspiration lives in freedom, and the woman who has stopped saving everyone around her creates space for herself. And in that space, something long forgotten begins to bloom. The desire to live, to feel, to create, to choose, not out of fear, but out of love. She becomes like a garden after the rain, not yet in full bloom, but alive. And that is enough. When a woman chooses herself, she stops begging. She no longer pleads for love. She doesn't try to prove her worth. She doesn't strive to earn attention. She simply is. This is not pride. This is dignity. Alfred Adler once said, "A person doesn't need to prove their worth. They need to realize it." And a woman who stops sacrificing herself finally truly understands, "I am already worthy, not because someone chose me, but because I exist." In that realization, there is immense freedom and a deep, sacred silence. Such a woman does not demand, and because of that, she receives. She does not cling, and that's why she radiates. She does not bargain for attention, because her gaze already holds everything. A woman who has chosen herself knows how to be alone without feeling lonely, because in that solitude there is fullness. She knows what's truly hers will stay, and everything else is not a loss but a liberation. And so only those who feel this remain near her, that to be close to her, you must be real, no pretending, no performing. Because with a woman who has chosen herself, there is no other way. Alfred Adler once said, "A person's dignity unfolds when they stop depending on the opinions of others and begin living by their inner law." Such a woman has her own inner law. It speaks quietly like a breath, But every movement she makes, every word, every glance is infused with this invisible strength. She no longer asks, and that is why she is given. When a woman chooses herself, she stops searching for love. And then, love comes. Without struggle, without pain, without the endless, "I must do this to be loved." She no longer builds relationships to fill a void. She is already full. And so, a different kind of love enters her life. Not the one that promises, "I'll make you happy," but the one that whispers, "You are already happy, and I'm simply beside you." Alfred Adler often said, "True love begins where two people can be themselves, without losing themselves in each other." And this is the kind of love a woman who has chosen herself is ready for. She doesn't dissolve into her partner. She walks beside them, not beneath, not above, but beside, because she knows her worth, because she's not afraid of being alone, because she doesn't mistake love for need. She is capable of loving, truly, without control, without fear, without the urge to change. The love that comes to a mature woman is a warm space, not a stage for drama. It is support, not dependency. It is a meeting, not an escape from oneself. Such a woman does not need to be chosen because she has already chosen herself. And so she chooses, not out of fear of being alone, but from the desire to walk together, to share not only joy, but also silence, not only passion, but also peace. Alfred Adler wrote, "Love, like respect, is only possible between two mature individuals, each of whom knows who they are." The woman knows, and this knowing gives her not only strength, it gives her the possibility of being loved truly, without masks, without sacrifice, without pain. Sometimes the journey back to oneself is long, sometimes painful, but always healing. A woman who stops sacrificing and chooses herself doesn't receive a prize. She receives life, a life without betraying herself, where every morning is not a burden but an opportunity, where every no is an act of care for her soul, and every yes is an act of honesty. She receives inner peace, without guilt, without the constant "I must," without trying to earn love. A peace in which she knows what is truly hers will come, and what leaves is not a loss, but a release. She receives depth, conversations with meaning, relationships with growth, silence that holds no loneliness. She receives love, not the kind you fight for, but the kind you arrive into when you're ready to be real. A woman who has chosen herself receives strength, soft as silk, quiet as dusk, but undeniable. Alfred Adler once said, "Happiness is not something that comes from outside. It is the state of living in harmony with oneself." And a woman who has chosen herself lives in that harmony. She no longer fears being alone. She no longer fears being different. She no longer fears living her own way, because she knows she does not need to be convenient to be loved. She does not need to be perfect to be worthy. She does not need to sacrifice herself to be needed. She simply is, alive, honest, deep, and in that, everything. A woman who has chosen herself doesn't lose, she finds. Doesn't burn out, she shines. Doesn't wait, she moves forward. And she receives everything.